You won't be flying through stars tonight, but drifting low above a quiet stretch of Pacific sky, where silence weighs more than altitude and the clouds know how to keep a secret. No turbulence, no radar. Just smooth air and a signal that forgets to finish. If your room is still, let it stay that way. Dim the lights. Let the hush settle over you like soft moss. What you'll hear tonight won't ask for attention, it will simply be there, like the rhythm of someone else's breath beside you, slow and sure. This isn't history as thunder. It's memory as a quiet drumbeat, gentle, low, insistent. Red light blinks once in the flight cabin, then decides not to insist. A pilot leans back, not knowing he's already vanished in the paperwork. Below, the ocean rises like an unrolled blueprint, empty except for one invisible signature. No wreckage, no return. Only unanswered coordinates, if stories like this make sleep come a little easier. Feel free to subscribe or leave your time and place in the comments. Who knows? The next story might begin exactly where your last one drifted out of reach. Now. A radio crackles somewhere over Guam, and no one answers. Asterisk, it began in workshops that smelled of linseed oil and half-cooled iron. Where millwrights tried mating bolts from Leeds with nuts from Liverpool, only to discover the threads sulked past one another like mismatched clock gears. Some grooves leaned at 55 degrees, some at 65, some at angles so ad hoc they looked drawn by size. A locomotive foreman complained his crews were carrying 3 spanners for every one bolt, which made front pockets clink like modest xylophones during tea breaks. Enter Joseph Whitworth, a man who believed even chaos could be coaxed into incremental obedience. With a brass protractor, a pile of orphans' bolts, and the unhurried faith of someone counting sheep, he measured thread after thread until the arithmetic of their disagreement settled into a single proposition: lean them. All exactly 60 degrees. Pitch them by whole number threads per inch, and let the metal doze contentedly. The hook, as soft as a lathe's burr, came from Whitworth's first public demonstration. He fitted one of his new bolts through a plate drilled lazily crooked, tapped it once with a wooden mallet, and it seated itself so naturally the watching apprentices applauded in whispers. Newspapers ran sleepy sketches of the groove, calling it engineering's new bedtime story, a pun that grated on editors but survived because deadlines, like drill bits, grow blunt. Within weeks, manufacturers received a light CTA printed in polite copperplate. Should you remain awake beyond supper, kindly try the 60-degree form. Refusal will not be prosecuted, merely frowned upon. Most firms, allergic to frowns, complied, though a few continental workshops muttered that French threads already sang sweetly at 55, "Thank you," and would not relearn the tune. Each workshop that adopted the Whitworth pitch became a micro-hook generator. In Birmingham, a machinist observed the new angle expelled swarf in spirals so tidy they resembled metal fettuccine. A shipyard rigger swore the improved grip allowed him to tighten handrails by exactly 3 turns instead of the previous awkward 2.5. Somewhere in Glasgow, a blacksmith balanced 8 Whitworth nuts atop one another and claimed the stack stood straighter than a parish choir. An image so gently absurd it spread through pubs faster than mild ale. Yet none of these anecdotes wandered far. They circled back into the main thread, tightening the narrative of calm inevitability. By 1860, railway companies ordered tens of thousands of bolts, ground to the new law. Warehouses filled with boxes stenciled W1/2 to 12, W3/4 to 10, codes that looked like fractions daydreaming. Clerks, soothed by the symmetry, reported fewer ledger errors. One found she no longer wrote question marks in the screw column, a habit that had previously bewildered accountants. Even the Royal Navy, famously fastidious about salt and steel, commissioned vast stores of Whitworth threads. remarking that guns assembled 20 minutes faster when each bolt trusted every nut on the shelf. Somewhere between those guns and grandmother's sewing machines, the 60-degree angle quietly nested into domestic life. Lamp bases, piano stools, folding prams all began to revolve in metrical calm. There were tangents, of course, the micro-hooks that pop up every half minute to keep attention's eyelids propped. One inventor proposed a left-hand Whitworth thread for products destined for Australia, arguing water drains anti-clockwise below the equator and screws should sympathize. Patent reviewers, half amused, declined. Another tradesman carved a double-start Whitworth, hoping 2 smaller grooves would fasten twice as quickly. Customers found the effect disorienting, like climbing stairs 2 at a time while the staircase shrank. The design retired, head bowed to toolshed folklore. A soft punchline circulated. What has 60 degrees and keeps secrets? Answer, a Whitworth bolt tight enough to impersonate peace and quiet. Through repetition, the reward cycle persisted. Detail angle expand workshop, tail soft, humor return. Each time the pattern settled, committees refined thread. Tables, adding sizes and fractions that felt like lullaby verses, 1/4 by 20, 5/16 by 18, 3/8 by 16. The numbers, when read aloud, slowed breaths. Factory inspectors noticed machines vibrated less when all fasteners followed identical geometry. Operators speculated the bolts themselves, whispered correspondence, crest to crest, root to root asking about life at the far end of torque. Across the Atlantic, however, American engineers preferred threads of 60 degrees, but different. Pitch counts. The inevitable transoceanic compromise arrived in 1898 as sellers convened under gaslit chandeliers to trade wrenches in size. The unified thread, they decided, would share the Whitworth angle but adopt flattened crests to please American lays allergic to sharp peaks. Some Brits grumbled the flattening ruined poetry. Yankees shrugged, claiming practicality hums its own lullaby. Yet both camps agreed the 60-degree slope must remain the universal pillow on which every nut could finally rest. World wars rolled through foundries, but even urgency bowed to angle. Shell casings, tank tracks, aircraft engine blocks all carried the subdued genealogy of Whitworth's early sketches. Soldiers tightening bolts by lantern light seldom knew they were twisting history's quiet compromise, but their hands remembered. In post-war suburbia, lawnmower handles assembled on kitchen floors clicked into place with the same measured feel. Half turn, nudge, quarter turn, release like a metronome marking moderation. Meanwhile, the ISO committee, always attracted to slumber-worthy vistas, adopted metric derivatives, M61 threads sharing identical degrees, though measured in millimeters that rolled off engineers' tongues like small, soothing pebbles. Micro-hooks persisted. A Swiss watchmaker demonstrated screws so tiny a puff of breath might misthread them. Yet thanks to the angle, they aligned under a jeweler's loop as obediently as grandfather clock bolts the size of crayons. Hobbyists building model railways discovered that mild steel bots and brass nuts seldom seized when the 60-degree. Womb carried a dab of machine oil, call it engineering's chamomile. Even stories of failure lulled more than startled. One coastal power plant ordered replacement bolts, mispitched by a single thread per inch, a defect so subtle it jammed at the third turn, producing a mutter rather than catastrophe. Fitters, recognizing the unique rasp, paused, fetched gauges, and returned the batch. Disaster, bored, wandered off to sea. Minutes filed the incident under illustrative of standards necessity, a heading sure to induce nods. And now, long after Whitworth's protractor has yellowed to the shade of old toast, you may grip any ordinary screw, hold it to the lamp, and see those rhythmic grooves circling down like a gentle staircase into focus. Tilt it. Watch light stripe the flanks at one precise angle steeper than lethargy. gentler than haste inviting a screwdriver to settle, bite, and turn. Feel the thread recall every lathe hymn hummed in century-old warehouses, each verse smoothing, burrs into lullabies. Turn slowly between thumb and finger, one revolution, perhaps two. Hear the faint rasp, a dry whisper reminiscent of pages turning in reference volumes nobody now checks out. Breathe with that rasp. Imagine endless rows of bolts cooling on conveyor belts, their grooves catching evening lamplight like concentric. Sunsets. Picture them shipped across oceans in crates padded with straw and quiet expectation, waiting to bring two given pieces of the world calmly together. Consider that each crest, each route, carries within its 60-degree discipline the promise that things can connect without drama wood to steel, motion to rest, waking to sleep. If your eyelids begin sliding down their own measured slope, let them follow the spiral inward. Feel thoughts thread gently into dusk, memory meshing with dream, concern tightening just enough to hold, but never so much it strips. The pitch is chosen, the angle keeps, the torque of day is spent. One final half turn, snug but not strained, and the mind, like a well-seated nut, can stop spinning. In that stillness, a hush rings faintly metal against metal, root to crest signaling. Assembly complete, story secured, night fastened. Allow that hush to settle over you, a standard quietly achieved, and drift into sleep. You might not expect a routine military charter in 1962 to slip away as gently as steam leaving a breakfast kettle, yet that is exactly how the Lockheed Connie of Flight 739 nosed through the Guam darkness, carrying 93 uncelebrated. Passengers toured duties even coffee could not quite make glamorous. If you're still awake by the time this soft meander drifts beyond the waiting runway lights, feel free ever so lazily to tap subscribe, or don't. Radios once dozed too, and it hardly troubled the Pacific. The evening airfield fussed, with the tiny chores of departure, a clipboard clock here, a tire sigh there, each sound no louder than an old typewriter spacebar. Ground crew in salt-stiff uniforms tugged wheel chocks free while a junior officer counted clipboards again. Certain paperwork was a talisman against surprises. Passengers climbed the stairs carrying folded newspapers that would remain unread. Then at the middle, like polite bows. Inside, the cabin smelt of vinyl, canned orange juice, and whatever hopeful starch lingers in freshly ironed shirts. The navigator's pencil made the quietest tap on his chart, latitude laid beside longitude with the leisurely certainty of someone lining up deck hairs before sunrise. Nobody on board suspected the Pacific like misplacing things, though. In fairness, the ocean has always had more cupboards than labels dot hours later. Beneath the moon, the shape of a thoughtful comma, the radio operator prepared his routine position call. He cleared his throat, pressed the key, and found only a fizz and indifferent hush, as though the night had reached for the telephone and decided it preferred postcards. The crew tried again, dialing frequencies like safecrackers searching for the click of company, but every channel answered with the faint sound of soda rising to a forgotten surface. Instruments behaved, needles keeping their steady classroom posture, yet the silence hung over them the way a coat hangs on a hook that suddenly remembers it isn't mailed in. Somewhere aft, a passenger shifted in half-sleep, dreaming perhaps of breakfast menus that would not require interpretation. Up front, the captain logged the missing contact in pencil because ink felt too definite for an absence dot by dawn. The ocean had turned the color of unpolished pewter, rolling its shoulders under thin clouds that looked like misplaced correction. Fluid, the flight's last plotted mark drifted westward on Navy charts, kept under small brass weights. Those weights performed their modest gravity with admirable composure, while officers considered possibilities, static storms, a sleepy tuner, perhaps an antenna sulking in nitrified drizzle. Search planes lifted off with engines coughing slightly. At early fuel, their crews peering through bubble windows like cat owners searching under sofas. Radar screens in distant bunkers swept their green brushes across blank canvases, collecting nothing but numerical dust. One technician recorded coordinates of every non-sighting, building a ledger of emptiness so meticulous it almost glowed. If you stack enough zeros, they say, you hear them settle like snow. Families back home opened telegrams that performed the elaborate politeness of saying very little over too many lines. The status of the aircraft is currently unresolved, one sentence recited, as though uncertainty were a kind of weather best faced with umbrellas. Breakfast tables acquired the hush usually reserved for cathedrals, spoons pausing mid-clink, cereal absorbing more milk than appetite. Someone rang a base switchboard and heard sympathetic breathing at the other end, punctuated only by soft pencil ticks marking yet another inquiry. Even rumors arrived muffled, talk of sabotage folded. Discreetly into envelopes, sightings pared down to tasteful half-sentences. A barber in Guam told customers he had seen a glow on the horizon, but revised the glow downward each retelling until finally, it was merely the barber's sign reflected in a late pane of glassed artificial theories lined up like timid children. At a school medical, mechanical failure whispered first. Navigational slips squeaked second. Sabotage coughed politely. Unidentified aerial interference tried out a shrug. None volunteered to step forward and to prove. Investigators convened in offices smelling of coffee cooled beyond ambition. They shuffled photographs of nothing in particular, then wrote reports noting the satisfactory condition of evidence that did not exist. One soul suggested deploying ocean floor microphones to detect unusual metallic sighs, but budget clerks feared overtime for squid. In the absence of answers, the Pacific grew its folklore. Fishermen reported hearing propellers hum beneath swells on windless evenings. Though no wake followed those rumors to shore, the ocean is kind that way. It keeps confidences even from itself. Years passed with a mild speed of dust settling on a mantel clock. Flight numbers rotated to fresh routes. Stewardesses practiced safety spiels for new audiences. And the vanished Connie became a footnote that sometimes forgot which chapter it belonged to. Yet a few details lingered. An airman's wristwatch found adrift in driftwood but dated before the flight. A scrap of aluminium stenciled Inspect 61 that washed ashore a decade late and 1,000 miles wide. None truly persuasive. Families gathered once a year beside a quiet memorial stone no larger than a bus timetable. They recited names into wind that carried the syllables just far enough to feel delivered, then clapped pockets shut against the same breeze. The Pacific, obliging as ever, replied with a wave pattern resembling Morse for still here, though. Translations vary by patience, and so, into the present hush, you may imagine that vanished Connie still tracing a lazy arc above the water. Contrails lengthening like penciled ellipses, no eraser bothers. Inside, cabin lights glow at reading lamp. Strength, illuminating crossword squares eternally unfilled. The navigator's chart hovers under its brass weights, latitude and longitude engaged in an unhurried waltz that never reaches the page edge. In the galley, coffee settles to a calm black mirror, reflecting nothing but itself. Outside, moonlight finds the fuselage and refuses excitement, merely notes the aluminium's cool preference for anonymity. Engines murmur a steady lullaby, free of destination, free of arrival, circling the same patient sky. If your eyelids join that circle, let them. Imagine the radios now, silent yet turned dutifully to frequency, their dials like half-closed eyes. Picture the ocean far below, surface unruffled as silk pressed beneath a polite palm. No radar sweep intrudes. No urgency calls a name. Only the faint arithmetic of altitude steadies the cabin, numbers ticking in soft increments, promising nothing more dramatic than the next soft breath. And just as that, Connie settles ever deeper into the safest holding pattern history could. Forget, you too may glide barely moving wings, barely stirring thought further from wakefulness, until even the faint hum of engines fades into a hush so wide it simply lets go of sound, of time, of questions, and lulls you, quite gently, into sleep. You might not expect a routine hop from Guam to vanish with the hush of a library page being turned, yet Flight 739 did precisely that, leaving behind nothing louder than puzzled paperwork and a faint whiff of jet fuel cologne, if you're still alert by the time we reach the first quiet crackle of static. You may subscribe, or leave the button sleeping beneath its own little cloud of indifference. Radios once snapped too, and the Pacific never scolded them. The departure itself was almost suburban in its ordinariness, a dusky March apron scattered with chalks, the Lockheed Connie's fuselage reflecting sodium lamps like someone polishing a long tin whistle, and 93 passengers performing. The familiar choreography of stowing valises, padding pockets, pretending they remembered every detail of the safety card. Orders were sealed in envelopes that looked mildly embarrassed to be secret. Engines wound up in progressive yawns, and the final wave from ground crew carried the same energy as closing a garden gate, satisfied but expecting nothing exotic. Within the cabin, return tickets lounged in breast pockets with the quiet confidence of items that believed they would be scanned again, and the navigator's pencil tapped latitude into the margin of a chart already creased in all the reassuring places. It was 1962, after all. A year so convinced of its own forward motion that it hummed optimism even through rivets. Climbing to cruise, the Connie stitched a straight white seam across a rather blazed sky, radar pings from Guam shrinking to lowercase. On the console until they finally pressed the period key and stopped. At 20:02 local, the radio officer keyed the microphone for a routine position fix, longitude napping beside latitude, but what came back was an acknowledgement, merely a fizz reminiscent of a soda siphon emptied yesterday. He tried again, swinging dials through frequencies in gentle arcs, expecting the usual polite coughing of distant voices. Instead, only marble-cold hush returned, filling his headset like slow milk. Instruments in the cockpit behaved with well-mannered needles. Engines purred in four-part harmony, yet the ether around them had folded its arms and refused correspondence. The Connie sailed on a heading scrawled 4 hours earlier somewhere. Between Guam's receding glow and a dawn she was increasingly unlikely to keep. Beside the flight deck curtain, the steward poured tepid coffee, unaware that somewhere among the radio valves, a type of silence had settled in an obedient, domesticated hush that nevertheless intended never to leave. When the aircraft failed to report during scheduled HF checks, Guam's night controller blinked once, as people do when they feel a folder's half-changing. His subsequent calls found only atmospherics scuffing their feet. Secondary radar screens glowed blankly, presenting the controller with the cartographic equivalent of a shrug. Word traveled across teletape ribbons, then along cables that smelled faintly of hot dust. Possible loss of contact. Stand by. Search and rescue. Planners unrolled maps featuring more ocean than certainty, drawing rectangles reminiscent of birthday invitations written in pencil, so lightly one could change the date without erasing. Within hours, a handful of C-130s lifted, crews peering through perspex domes at wave fields that appeared to have ironed themselves smooth for the occasion. No oil slicks winked, no lift-rafts fluttered, only the laugh-line sparkle of moonlight on unbothered swell. At command headquarters, officers compared ideas like mismatched socks, equipment failure, sudden decompression, sabotage dressed in official secrecy. Each theory performed a small bow. None stayed for questions as telegrams seeped toward home addresses. Speculation backfilled the vacuum. Some claimed extraterrestrial mischief, citing a Liberian tanker whose lookout saw an orange Bloom extinguished itself neatly, although the ship's log, possibly bored, recorded only sky unusually busy with stars. Others whispered of sabotage, an unmanifested crate, rumored to carry radar parts for covert installations, perhaps exploded by hands too polite to sign their work. Families phoned switchboards that hummed with sympathetic vowels, only to receive phrases like "all avenues under review," bureaucratic cotton wool that sounded absorbent yet soaked up nothing. One uncle, determined to do arithmetic with grief, calculated fuel range, wind drift, and probable ditch zones on his kitchen table, using bottle caps as placeholders. The pattern resembled polka dots more than closure. Radio hams reported odd pulses on shortwave channels, and though every pulse can be coaxed into importance by insomniacs, this one was courteously filed anyway, just in case faint SOS rhythms were hiding inside. Meanwhile, newspapers balanced excitement with decorum, printing sketches of a super constellation adrift among thumbnail UFOs, while columnists wondered whether classified cargo meant consequences too shy for daylight. Search efforts expanded. Budgets dropped subtle coughs, and the Pacific maintained its slow habit of forgetting immediately after swallowing. Flight 739 earned a line on missing aircraft lists, pinned between older disappearances already frayed at the corners. A naval acoustic array, fresh from whale song duties, listened for impact echoes months after the event and returned with nothing. Louder than shrimp applause. Eventually, presumed lost sat chiseled above the date on memorial plaques' epitaphs as lightweight as the brass they occupied. Families held yearly roll call vigils by coastal railings, reading names that gusted over water like library pages turned too quickly. Some attendees said the waves replied with soft syllables, though ocean tongues are notoriously fluent and comforting. Lies. In Guam, runway concrete sprouted a hairline crack where the Connie last rolled, and ground crew refused to patch it. Superstition's shallow moat around memory dot decades tiptoed on. Satellites littered low Earth orbits with camera eyes capable of reading tide timetables from space, yet none glimpsed aluminium wreckage. Flight 739 became a study case for probability theorists, who wrote papers full of integrals that curved like contrails, then evaporated just as neatly. In aviation museums, docents mentioned the disappearance between polished propeller blades, and visitors nodded, already drifting toward gift shops. Every so often, a beachcomber found corroded fragments, a valve stem, perhaps, or an anonymous. Rivet and delivered them to local constabularies that labeled boxes, possible aircraft debris, before tucking them onto shelves of indefinite waiting. Those shelves, if you could listen, would likely hum lullabies composed of patience and soft rust, which brings us gently to tonight. Imagine a moonlit swath of Pacific where nothing important has happened for hours. Above, maybe still, a Connie. Coasts in the endless holding pattern of story. Cabin lights dimmed to bedtime amber. Passengers suspended mid-sentence in magazines that no longer add pages. Engines droning a tone half remembered from radio tests you once fell asleep to. The cockpit. Gauges freeze at plausible values fuel steady. Altitude polite while radios wear their dignified silence like black tie. Below, the ocean lies smooth as a page awaiting ink, though none arrives. You, safely distant, may picture those unspent return tickets vibrating in shirt pockets with every engine pulse, trying to remind the fabric of scheduled futures that will remain penciled indefinitely. Allow that image to drift until words here smear into drowsy streaks. See the horizon dissolve into more horizon, wavelets riffling like thin pages of some government report few will finish. Feel the slow pull of sleep aligning with the Connie's unhurried arc, neither climbing nor descending, just circling a quiet region outside coordinates and clock hands. If your eyelids settle now, they join a long tradition, airfields falling. Dark after operations, telegraph keys resting, ocean swells rolling over questions until even inquiry snores. The engines fade, radio fizz diminishes, and the Pacific, unhurried archivist of untidy stories, adds one more side to its vaultware. Your own soft breathing can file itself, unnoticed and entirely welcome, among the unruffled pages of night. You might not expect an airplane crew to worry about something as ordinary as the way canned orange juice loses its fizz at altitude, and yet that was the most pressing concern recorded in Flight 739's galley log as it taxied off the Guam tarmac. On that hushed March evening in 1962, the mechanic who tasted the flat juice made a note in the margin. Bubbles non-compliant, recommends spare tin, never guessing his remark would become one of the last certainties preserved about. A journey that should have been as routine as morning socks. The super constellation rolled beneath filament floodlights that looked half-hearted, the sort of glow you get when an airport is trying not to disturb its own dusk, and passengers shuffled aboard in the mild aftertaste of tropical rain. Each inhaled that rubbery cabin smell of vinyl, copier ink, and institutional coffee, unaware they were stepping into a future that would politely erase its forwarding address. Even the departure slip read like lukewarm tea guests, cargo, weather, agreeable. Takeoff clearance arrived in clipped syllables, the radio operator answering with a nod you would have missed if your blink ran long. Moments later, the big aircraft lifted as carefree as a paper dart launched across an office, climbing through clouds still warm enough to yawn. Inside, a steward balanced a tray of white enamel cups and announced in the unhurried voice of timetables that the mission to Saigon or maybe Bangkok, or maybe somewhere best not footnoted, was expected to run like sewing thread through fabric no one need unpick. Military secrecy simply draped over everything like a courtesy coat that didn't fit, that had to be worn. Hours passed with the gentle predictability of ceiling fans, propellers humming in four-part harmony against the Pacific's wide hush. The navigator drew a fine pencil line on his chart, and the line behaved, always agreeable to arithmetic. Radios sparkled with static and splinters of friendly greetings from other craft, distant as cousins at Christmas. Yet somewhere around midnight, the ether slipped off its chair. A routine position report tried to rise, but fell back like a napkin accidentally tugged off a table. The frequency answered with soft glass fizz, as though someone were tuning an old television to an extinct channel. The radio operator sought alternate bands, but each one culminated in a hush so thick it felt padded. Dials glowed, needles kept calm, cabin lights stayed as soft as library lamps, yet every attempted syllable vanished into a velvet sack. In Guam, the controller checked patch leads, found no fault, and chalked the Connie's last coordinates on the board, a dot adrift among dozens, and waited for the next check-in that would never arrive. Sea-level radars, their range, always an optimist, produced nothing but green rivers of noise, no friendly ripple of aluminium sliding across the grid. Down in the cabin, passengers dozed, the hum of engines lulling them into a dream about layovers, filled with coffee cups and politely misplaced umbrellas. No one heard the sky swallow Flight 739's final whisper, the way a calm hallway swallows a dropped pin, into that hush-spilled human conjecture, which is never so quiet. Theories budded like algae wherever sunlight couldn't quite reach. A Liberian tanker crew claimed they saw a quick fist of fire descend beyond the horizon, a star that blinked off as though embarrassed by its own flourish. Newspapers fed on the image, adding sketches of saucers hovering like inattentive waiters above the fuselage. Cable traffic mentioned sabotage in discreet italics, referencing an unlisted crate in the hold that might have contained sensitive electronics or, depending on who was pouring drinks, a dossier thicker than the aircraft manual. Families were told only that radio contact was unexpectedly terminated, a phrase so determinedly calm it sounded tranquilist. Someone tabulated every previous Pacific disappearance and published an average. One aircraft gone for every million square miles of water, which comforted no one because the ocean owns far too many zeros. Privately, inquiry boards discovered they could not even agree on whether the Connie carried a flight recorder. Regulations in 1962 allowed such things to be optional, the aviation equivalent of bringing along a spare umbrella if clouds looked literary enough. Thus, investigators were forced to search for a voice no microphone had promised to remember. Weeks slid by like envelopes across a varnished post office counter. Navy patrol craft combed the search boxes, their sonar pings echoing back at perfectly boring intervals. The Pacific answered every question with the rake of wind across wave crests and nothing else. At one point, a Coast Guard cutter retrieved a life preserver, sun-bleached and stenciled with Navy supply codes. But paperwork proved its serial number had been disposed of 2 years earlier during a drill. Meanwhile, relatives kept vigil beside. Telephones tethered by cords that seemed shorter with each silent ring, and when telegrams finally arrived declaring the search, curtailed, they sounded apologetic in the way rain sometimes apologizes to rooftops. Conspiracy's embers glowed on, of course. Cafe chatter about underwater bases, cloaked projectiles, secret courier swaps on remote atolls. Yet eyewitnesses, when found, mostly shrugged and repeated the same sentence. We saw nothing. Their nothing became the flight's entire biography. Decades downgraded the incident from conversation to parenthesis. Super constellations retired. Jets drew contrails higher and thinner than any prop Corona, and radar coverage eventually stitched. The Pacific like quote squares. Still Flight 739 lingered at the edge of flight safety seminars. A case study presented between coffee breaks, the lecturer tapping a slide that read, total contact time, 64 minutes, as though reading a minimalistic poem. A sonar expedition in the early 2000s pinged a metallic silhouette matching a constellation's bones, but the depth recorder malfunctioned, leaving only blurred lines that might equally belong to an old steel barge or a very decisive shoal of tuna. Back in Guam, a maintenance hangar scheduled for demolition revealed a forgotten locker labeled 739. Inside lay a clipboard bearing a single coffee stain and a checklist so routine it felt like a lullaby. Fuel caps secure, tail navigation lamp replaced, galley stores inventoried. The discovery made local headlines for one weekend and was then folded gently into a display case, where it now sits between a cracked altimeter dial and an oil-stained handkerchief purportedly used by the flight engineer. Tonight, if you step outside into air cool enough to suggest altitude, you can almost picture that Connie still wandering a quiet holding pattern just beyond eventfulness. Its cabin lights dimmed to considerate glow, its engines throttled back to economical serenity. It circles a longitude that never made it to any meridian. Inside, the flat orange juice haunts galley shelves, unshaken, while the radio set waits an everlasting key down, listening for a response history decided not to write. And you, lulled by this notion of an airplane at eternal idle, may feel your own thoughts begin to loiter. The Pacific becomes a padded blanket, the radio's a white noise machine, and every unanswered call a gentle invitation to rest. Let the super constellation keep flying its comfortable loop. Let the search grids remain empty as freshly ironed sheets, and permit your mind the small luxury of hovering, unhurried, in that same soft air until sleep, like a waypoint without coordinates, finally welcomes you home. You might not expect a chartered military flight to slip out of history as softly as a bookmark falling from an overhandled library novel, yet that is precisely how Flight 739 rolled away from Guam in March 1962, engines murmuring agreeable, cliches about horsepower while its 93 passengers adjusted armrests and assumed tomorrow would behave. If you're still awake by the time we mosey past the first politely missing radio check, feel entirely free to subscribe. Or let the button drowse untouched. The Pacific never fussed over paperwork, and neither should we. The evening tarmac shimmered with leftover rain, so every reflection looked lightly ghosted like carbon copies of itself. Maintenance crew took tasks, tire pressure, fuel cap torque, one stubborn hinge gifted a drop of oil each, tick a tiny. Inoculation against excitement. Passengers filed aboard beneath sodium lamps that made every uniform appear monochrome, as though secrecy had already begun its quiet laundering. Inside, the Super Constellation's cabin lights glowed at that early 1960s. Setting doctors might have called restful but still hopeful, and a steward performed the ceremonial crack of a new thermos, the metallic clunk that promises coffee will try its best. Military orders, folded into stiff manila, rested in a briefcase nobody bothered to lock, because the surest disguise for importance has always been boredom. At 1912 local, tower clearance arrived in clipped syllables, answered by the captains. Not so minuscule it could have doubled as a twitch. Throttles advanced. The Connie answered with a slow rolling purr. Tires left the runway, and Guam's perimeter lights slid backward as neatly as toys on a belt. Cloud tops settled beneath the wing roots like piled laundry no one wanted to fold. The navigator's pencil drew longitude across linen-textured charts, shaping routines so familiar they almost wrote themselves. In the galley, a corporal muttered about orange juice carbonation altitude. He grumbled, murder's fizz, and wrote, "Bubbles?" No, on a pad, because operational thoroughness sometimes chooses strange hills to defend. Hours drifted, cabin hum, engines clearing throats in synchronized patience. The radio operator trading weather banter with a freighter somewhere near Yap. Then, near midnight, he keyed the mic for a routine position report, expecting those agreeable clicks of acknowledgement. Instead, the ether exhaled static as soft as television snow. He switched frequencies, coaxed dials, straightened headset leads, still nothing but that furry hush, the auditory equivalent of a shrug. Cockpit needles stayed obedient airspeed, manifold pressure, cabin altitude all politely aligned, yet their silent companion on the panel. The HF signal needle refused even a token twitch. He tried once more, voice composed, and thought he heard a distant syllable cloud or loud, or maybe just the ocean rustling its skirt, but whatever it might have been, it unthreaded itself before context could sew on a button dot by the next scheduled check-in. Guam's controller stared at a blank section of green radar glass, a space usually reserved for background gossip, but now alarming precisely because it conversed with no one. His follow-up call reached only static, a fizz reminiscent of seaside foam popping one bubble at a time. Search and rescue planning began, with rulers on charts, concentric rectangles, each large enough to host an ordinary country, penciled gently so the erasers wouldn't feel bullied later. C-130 crews pre-dawned themselves awake, strapped into canvas seats still warm with yesterday, and lifted into gray. Down below, the Pacific presented its usual party trick of appearing both mirror-flat and immodestly endless. No oil sheen winked, no raft stitched orange across blue. Back in Guam, a second controller copied the aircraft's last coordinates onto a clipboard and circled them, as if rings of graphite could fence off distress. At family housing blocks, payphones began to ring in a courtesy cadence, offering sentences like, "Radio contact was interrupted," delivered in tones that tried to separate words from harm dot when silence deepens. Imagination crowds and like polite tourists offered free biscuits. Newspapers flirted with extraterrestrial headlines. Lights seen in Lost Plane, quoting a Liberian tanker lookout who described an orange bloom switched off, neat as a lamp, though his watch log merely noted, "Sky brightened briefly." Sabotage theories unbutton hush-hush whispers, unmanifested cargo in a locked hold, perhaps sensitive electronic guts destined for out-of-bounds radar sites. A clerk at the Saigon receiving office swore he had a memo indicating a top-secret training team on board, then conveniently misplaced the memo behind a filing cabinet taller than integrity. Somewhere in Nevada, a radio ham picked up a staccato, burst on 21 megahertz, and decided it spelled SOS in creatively spaced Morse. His wife, less romantic, thought it resembled a lawnmower idling 2 gardens over. Amid the static of explanation, families clung to etiquette, starching tablecloths before the chaplain visited, brewing coffee strong enough to cradle shock until it dissolved like sugar-got weeks lengthened into a season. Search grids ballooned until budget sighed, and logistics officers gifted phrases such as low probability area to camouflage surrender. All that ever surfaced was a single life jacket, label half bleached, serial number traced eventually to Pacific stock, but not to any particular airframe. Inquiry boards convened in rooms that smelled faintly of carbon paper and quiet resignation, drafting reports where the phrase "unable to determine" repeated like a lullaby for bureaucrats. Black box regulations, still embryonic, meant the Connie carried no flight recorder, or if it did, nobody had paperwork admitting so. The Pacific, having accepted the aircraft with ritual discretion, offered back nothing but equatorial weather reports and the reassurance that waves keep their own minutes. Years slipped a slow deck of cards. Technology expanded radar shadows until fewer craft could hide, yet Flight 739 remained politely undercover. Aviation safety lecturers displayed its calcine on PowerPoint slides between coffee breaks, calling it an instructive absence. One sonar expedition thought it pinged an aluminium carcass half buried in silt, but the printout resembled equal parts fuselage and underwater hill, and funding evaporated before diving gear could argue. Memorial stones were set beside highways. Nobody planned to widen. Relatives read names each march, their syllables carried out over water like long-expired hail. In Guam, the hairline crack across the old runway, rumored to align perfectly with the Connie's last tire squeal, was never patched. Superstition's thin monument hiding in plain asphalt. Now, this evening, picture a calm loop of sky suspended indefinitely above unruffled water. You might imagine the Connie cruising still, cabin lights thawed to candle warmth, passengers reclining in semi-perpetual dusk. The radio's recalcitrant hush serves as white noise. Engines drone a circle that neither gains nor loses distance. Coffee remains forever tepid but never cold. Fizzles' orange juice waits for a toast no one remembers to raise. And the navigator's pencil hovers over a chart whose margins have grown wonderfully vague. Outside, the Pacific rolls on steady heartbeats of lunar pull patiently, keeping secrets in a filing system labeled later. Meanwhile, your own thoughts, perhaps warmed by this quiet failure of certainty, begin to tilt downward, following the aircraft's imagined lazy arc into comfortable nowhere. Breathe with that plane. 4 slow pulses of propeller wash, 1 gentle engine note hush, repeat. Let speculation fall away like static thinning at dawn. Allow the unsolved to remain pleasantly unzipped. And as Flight 739 continues its endless, soft circuit, neither arriving nor wholly gone, feel your own awareness join it, trimming throttle, banking into a cloud of slow forgetting, until sleep eases alongside, shoulder to shoulder at last. You might not expect a flight plan typed in perfectly ordinary carbon copy to end up filed under folklore, but paper, like people, sometimes strays. Flight 739's plant 2 creases, 1 coffee ring, rubber-stamped Guam departed should have taken its quiet place among thousands of dull itineraries from March 1962. Yet somewhere between the dispatcher's blotter and the archive's metal drawers, it drifted into legend, curling at the edges the way pages do when they realize they will not be turned again for a very long while. If you're still with me by the time we reach the first soft fizz of unreturned calls, feel entirely free to subscribe, or let the button lounge untouched. After all, radios once lounged untouched too, and they never heard the sky complain. The departure was almost bashful in its ordinariness. Fuel trucks chugged away, smelling faintly of paraffin and coconuts. Tires hissed as weight settled, and the super constellation's propeller blades rotated in slow rehearsal arcs, warming crankcases while passengers found their numbered seats. Most of those seats still bore canvas labels stitched during the Eisenhower administration gray on grayer, while overhead racks rattled, just enough to remind everyone that aircraft interiors are, at heart, large musical instruments tuned to the key of practical. Boarding lists were checked, then checked again, because double-checking is a reflex whenever secrecy tries to look casual. In the cockpit, the navigator laid his protractor on a chart already softened by finger oils from previous missions. Longitude and latitude crossed like knitting needles over a woolen sea. One engineer made a note that the cabin air smelled slightly metallic but acceptable, the sort of comet future investigators orbit when larger facts float just out of reach. At 1912 local, clearance arrived as a pair of clipped syllables, Romeo. Mic and wheels lifted, leaving Guam's runway, lights receding like fireflies satisfied with their brief performance. Hours ticked past in the hum of arranged machinery. Engines thrummed a lullaby in 4 strokes, shorthand for reliable combustion, while cabin lights dimmed to something gentler than thought. A steward balanced cups of reconstituted orange drink, remarking that altitude murders bubbles with more courtesy than gravity. Somewhere aft, a passenger wrote a date on the corner of a paperback's flyleaf, unaware the book would one day lie on a thrift shop shelf missing its final chapters. Up front, the radio operator tapped out a routine position report that should have been met with equal brevity. Instead, the ether replied with neatly folded nothing static, so soft it resembled the inside of a seashell pressed to the ear. He tried again, voice pitched in the middling register technician's trust, and the silence deepened, pillows layering over sound until even possibility felt muffled. Dials glowed. Needles settled, no alarms fussed. Yet somewhere in that clean, paneled hush, the flight wandered off the map most people keep behind the eyes. Guam requested a repeat call. None came. Secondary radar scanned green plankton patterns across oscilloscopes, returning only the sea's ordinary heartbeat. Search planners unrolled maps on long tables and drew rectangles with the careful touch of gardeners planting hedges. Neither insects nor budgets would respect. Aircraft launched, their searchlights combing wave fields that sparkled like tin shavings in workshop dust. But the Pacific offered no scrap of aluminium, no oil sheen, no life raft bobbing with apologetic optimism. A Liberian freighter watchman reported a brief orange bloom extinguishing itself, as if the horizon had blinked. His captain wrote possible meteor in the log and underlined possible twice to avoid rumors. Meanwhile, families thousands of miles away answered telephones at hours that made clocks embarrassed, hearing only that contact was interrupted, a word that sounds temporary even when it is about to graduate to permanent. Speculation sprouted where proof refused water. Some argued for mechanical failure, a single bolt, over-tightened, shearing just when vibration peaked. Others preferred sabotage, eyes narrowing at shipping manifests that included sealed boxes marked electronics classified. A chaplain in Saigon heard whispers that the Connie's passengers were radar specialists bound for covert sites. And gossip. Being fond of symmetry, the idea echoed through newspaper corridors under headlines that feigned reluctance. The UFO theory fluttered too, buoyed by one villager on an atoll who saw a green spark at dawn, a story that lengthened with each retelling until it almost brushed orbit. Inquiry boards, starched into composure, filed interim reports heavy with all the ways proof can fail to arrive, hydrophones returning whale chatter, drift models undone by guinea pig currents, sonar images that could as easily be reef as wreck. One clerk, tasked with indexing these pages, later admitted the work felt like alphabetizing Gus. Months slipped into something more approximate than memory. Search budgets wilted. Ships were reassigned. The Pacific resumed its polite facade of infinite routine, and yet a few details refused total surrender. In Guam, a maintenance hangar's concrete gathered a fine fracture exactly where Flight 739's tires last pressed. The crack darkened after rain, a subtle underlining most workers stepped over without quite knowing why. In Manila, Customs ledger bore a line of red ink deleting an inbound consignment of circuit boards, code number matching a crate never seen again. Even decades later, a diver trawling for shipwrecks off Palau recorded sonar shadows that teased the outline of a constellation's triple tail. Funding evaporated before submersibles could check, leaving the screenshot to linger on message boards like a digital mirage dot tonight. Though the Pacific is flat enough to audition as a mirror for constellations, and you may imagine, if you wish, but the Connie still patrols a quiet arc just above that glass. Cabin bulbs glow at the strength of bedside lamps. Passengers breathe evenly, suspended between time zones that no longer court them. The radio, its transmitter key held down by a piece of forgotten tape, continues to broadcast hush on unmonitored frequencies, silence amplified, sent outward, turning static into lullaby. The engines, unbothered by fuel limits in the soft, imagining sustain a drone, equal parts heartbeat and rocking chair. Coffee cools to a sensible room temperature and remains there, unhurried, while the navigator's pencil point never blunts. If your eyelids feel the same drift those engines promise, let them follow. Think of the Pacific rolling furl after furl, its waves smoothing any sharp-edged worry until only rounded thoughts remain. Imagine searchlights from long-landed aircraft still sweeping, that now just for practice their beams feather soft and undemanding. Hear a buoy bell in the far distance, the ocean's way of emphasizing commas rather than endings. And as the not quite found super constellation circles once more over coordinates nobody intends to correct, allow your own mind to idle alongside, instruments steady, radios quiet, crew calm. There's no destination to clock, no report to file, just the comfortable hum of something that agrees to exist without arriving. In that hum you may drift gently, drop by drop, until you too vanish from wakefulness, not sharply, not suddenly, simply slipping without a sound into sleep. You might not expect a municipal bylaw about how many umbrellas may huddle in a single iron stand to survive in dusty council minutes. Yet in 1891, the London borough of Holborn spent a damp spring deciding that public vestibules should host no more than 8 canopies per rack, with the 9th triggering an inspection and a small, politely worded fine. If you're still awake once we toddle past the first measured drip on linoleum, you could subscribe, though please don't hoist yourself on my account. The inspectors certainly never hurried after tea time. The matter began, as all very small tempests do, with a janitor's letter. He complained that commuters at the Carnaby Street tram terminus were jamming so many wet parasols into the waiting room stand that its wrought iron curls, already arthritic with rust, buckled like soft licorice. Umbrellas slumped, handles interlocked. Rainwater pooled until it staged tiny rebellions across the tessellated floor. Shoes squeaked, tempers followed, and by mid-April trolley conductors were timing their brakes to avoid the aquatic chaos. The borough clerk, a man who penciled margins, straighter than his own posture, scheduled an inquiry. Measurements ensued. One clerk counted 43 distinct umbrella diameters in local shops, everything from the modest bachelor stick at 28 inches to a flamboyant lady's chiffon parasol blooming to 37, and concluded that averaged 8 such cylinders filled the stand to a condition approaching civil tolerance. 8, he wrote, felt like a handshake. 9 felt like a cue. Ironmongers were informed by telegram. Standard stand capacity 8 stop. Height strictly 42 inches stop. Ownership tag required for 9th umbrella stop. Factories obligingly recast their molds, adding a discreet brass disc stamped 8. To each new rack, apprentices tested every specimen by lodging 8 dowels and shaking gently. If one dowel squeaked loose, the stand failed. Rejects were consigned to holding fire buckets, an afterlife they appeared to accept without complaint. Approved models left workshops smelling of new paint and the faint optimism of standardized metal, then arrived at termini under tarpaulin in a drizzle that seemed determined to audition them immediately. Commuters noticed first with sleeves, not eyes. Where coats had once brushed mystery puddles, now they met only politely dry tiles. Conductors embraced the new limit with whistling teeth devotion. On the 9th umbrella, they produced a clipboard, issued a tiny voucher, and invited the offender to carry the surplus upon their lap, or, should dignity insist, ride the next tram. The system quickly earned secret nicknames. Some called the voucher the rain check, though the pun wore thin faster than a silk canopy in a gale. Shopkeepers nearby began renting penny-per-hour umbrella lockers fashioned from repurposed coal chutes, and the chutes, discovering a novel purpose at last, rattled with genteel pride. Of course, anomalies tiptoed in. A certain barrister arrived wielding what newspapers dubbed the gargantuan, a family brawly wide enough to shade a quartet of cousins. Inspectors convened. After 3 days, they judged the object equivalent to 2 umbrellas by volume, but counted it as 1 by handle, thereby birthing the celebrated gargantuan clause that endures in footnotes longer than in memory. A milliner attempted collapsible hatbrellas felt cloches sprouting root. Silk canopies on command, but test audiences complained of dizziness when retracting them, and the venture folded like, well, unfortunate fabric. Winter rumbled. Icier storms tested the rack's metal. 8 soggy canopies thawed into orderly trips. Each droplet granted a measured plink before sliding into a porcelain trough thoughtfully built beneath the stand. Janitors tracked drip. Rates on graph paper, demonstrating that the averaged umbrella note per commuter declined from 19 seconds to 11. A statistic he presented proudly to a board subcommittee. They filed the chart under public comfort minor and went back to pricing coal. Decades ambled onward. Streetcars transformed into buses, felt toppers into felt nothing in particular. Yet the 8 umbrella rule lingered, engraved on. Small plaques nobody dusted, but everyone obeyed. Designers toyed with chromed racks, then bakelite, but each retained the brass disc with its stalwart digit, 8. During blackout nights of World War II, wardens improvised hoods over the stands to prevent moonshine reflections, yet the capacity remained sacred. Only when synthetic raincoats and pocket-sized folding parasols conquered pavements in the 1960s did usage quietly dwindle. A half-filled stand was now a full house, mathematically speaking, but the inspectors, long retired, had taken their clipboards to gentler afterlives. This evening, if you wander a surviving tram vestibule, many serve now as cafes inhaling espresso steam. You may still spot an original rack tucked beside the pastry cabinet. Its curls of iron lean slightly, the brass 8 dulled to the color of old treacle, yet 8 umbrellas still slot with satisfying snugness. Slide your own, perhaps only in imagination, into that 8th berth and sense the stand settle, relieved to reach capacity but not scandal. Rainwater will trickle to the trough in pre-agreed rhythms, Floor tiles will remain free of amphibious ambitions, and somewhere a ghostly clerk will tick an invisible box. If your eyelids are sliding down like reluctant awnings, think of those. Countless evenings when commuters, barely noticing, complied with a limit crafted in a modest spring hearing. 8 handles clacked home, 9th walked on. The rule had no grandeur, only measured practicality, yet its effect slightly drier linoleum. Slightly calmer tempers ripples even now in corners where umbrellas seldom stay but always pause. Let that small, soggy ordinance cradle your thoughts. No drama, no aeronautics, simply the quiet arithmetic of space shared sensibly. Allow your mind to rest, as those umbrellas did, inside a rack that will never ask for more than 8, and drift, drip by a measured drip, into sleep. You might not expect the thickness of a teacup's rim, the quiet millimeters where porcelain meets lip, to have kept a subcommittee of His Majesty's Board of Domestic Ware occupied for nearly an entire Edwardian winter. Yet in 1908, that very question rattled around Westminster corridors like a saucer searching for its purpose. Should the rim measure the practical 2 1/2 millimeters favored by railway buffets, or the more aristocratic 1 3/4 preferred by drawing room hostesses intent on delicate silhouettes? If you're still awake when we drift beyond the first tentative sip, feel free to subscribe, though don't lift a finger on my account. The clerk certainly never hurried when the kettle sang. It all began with the baker's dozen of chipped rims returned to the Royal Catering Depot after an especially drafty banquet for Midland's mayors. The depot's quartermaster, a man who catalogued teaspoons the way naturalists had moths, grumbled. That thin lipware snapped under the modest insult of railway car vibration. Meanwhile, London's grand hotels argued that thicker edges made tea taste industrial and encouraged unseemly slurping. Thus, a compromise committee convened in a paneled room smelling of pipe ash and new linoleum polish, the sort of scent that persuades ideas to speak softly. Their first experiment involved 112 cups arranged on trestle tables from thinnest to stoutest, each filled with identically brewed Darjeeling cooled to a temperature described as socially confident. Members were invited to sip in silence, and note the angle at which lips felt most academically satisfied. A barrister declared 3 millimeters, like kissing a municipal curb. A clergyman whispered that 1.5 felt verging on theological, whatever that implied. After 46 tastings, minutes record, the room grew gently giddy. One alderman insisted his teacup had spoken Latin. Measurements followed. Vernier calipers clicked, rim diameters were logged to the second decimal, and an assistant with a tuning fork tested resonance on the theory that the most reassuring chime, when tapped by teaspoon, would correspond to the optimum drinkers. Lol. 2 millimeters sharp produced a crisp F sharp the committee found too interrogative. 2.2 millimeters yielded a low E that resembled a polite throat clear. Pulses slowed. Note-takers exhaled as though curtains had been drawn against late sun. At this stage, a light CTA surface tea room proprietors were invited, and a circular printed on reassuring cream stock to send observations, should drowsiness not impede scribbling, which few did, preferring instead to nap politely after. Service. Back in Westminster, a chemist presented slides showing how tannins film differently along rims of varying curve. Thicker lips encourage slower cooling, keeping aromas trapped like gossip under a cloche. His diagrams, rendered in watercolor for style, resembled sleepy sunsets and were passed along the table with appreciative hums. Micro-hooks fluttered every so often. A retired sea captain described ceramic beakers at Cape Town that survived both typhoon and cabin fever. A milliner mentioned ladies fainting because too thin china suggested economy. Someone relayed that in Birmingham, the preference was dictated by mustache density, which thicker rims protected from scalds. Each tangent circled back to the main thread with comforting inevitability, like teaspoons orbiting saucer rims. By mid-February, the committee drafted its compromise, a standard rim of 2.25 millimeters, give or take a hair, glazed smoothly so that no lip, no matter how philosophical, would notice the engineering beneath the politeness. Manufacturers were notified by telegram. Cup rim gauge 2.25 mm, stop tolerance 0.15. Stop resonance target low E natural stop. Potteries at Stoke-on-Trent retooled molds. Artisans dipping fingers in slip to feel the new geometry settling like small, approving size. Test firings emerged ivory white, rims gleaming with the faint halo that good bone china earns when light leans in for a closer listen. Inspections involved balanced teaspoons dropped from a regulated height. If the resulting chime hovered inside, a tuning fork's gentle echo, the batch passed. Rejects were relegated to staff canteens, where nobody complained because free tea is itself a glaze against criticism. The new cups entered railway buffets first, lined up on zinc countertops beside. Steel urns panting faint steam prayers. Porters noticed travelers lingered one sip longer, perhaps because the rim felt like leaning on a well-mannered banister. Hotel lounges adopted them next. Waitresses reported fewer saucer clinks as thicker edges softened collisions. Even, the palace kitchens ordered 1,000, specifying a monogram so subtle it could only be spotted by insomnia. To measure public satisfaction, clerks were dispatched incognito to count midpoint refills. Their tallies suggested an encouraging uptick in second pours, surely proof the rim wooed tongues into contented curiosity. A cartoon in Punch depicted a gentleman asleep mid-conversation, cup balanced perfectly on lower lip, the caption reading, "Such comfort and porcelain should be taxed." A jest the Treasury considered but politely shelved. Winter thawed. The standard held, and soon a generation forgot alternatives. Yet anomalies wandered in like drowsy sheep. A Paris confectioner exported tulip-shaped cups tapering to a whisper thin. Flair, Londoners bought them for novelty, then stored them on mantelpieces as conversational yawns. Conversely, a Scottish foundry ventured steel-rimmed mugs for Highland. Trains allegedly indestructible, but passengers complained tea tasted. Faintly of cold anthems, and the project rusted after one season. Meanwhile, academic journals measured sip velocity versus rim thickness and concluded 2.25 millimeters reduced dribble incidence by a third, a statistic now quoted nowhere but here, drifting across the hum of our narrative like a paper boat. Decades meandered. Electric kettles replaced some of ours, yet the rim spec quietly survived. Wartime ration boards, forced to stretch China supplies, cut capacity but preserved edge gauge, noting morale rests disproportionately upon that first mouthful. In the 1950s, television commercials showcased housewives tapping rims with manicured nails, the resulting ping identical across brands proof of regulatory lullaby. Only with the rise of cardboard takeaway cups did the standard falter. Commuters discovered lips could adapt to pleated paper without formal committee. Blessings. Still, in hotel basements and church halls, stacks of regulation porcelain persisted, awaiting moments when stainless urns would purr and guests, half listening to speeches about nothing urgent, would cradle cups whose measured rims whispered, "Calm. Perhaps tonight you pour a late infusion chamomile. Maybe in the cup you lift, glazed moon pale, happens by accident to match that Edwardian decree. Feel the rim meet your lip, neither thick enough to announce itself nor thin enough to suggest impatience, simply present with the quiet confidence of a comma in a sentence that never hurries to its full stop. Steam fogs glasses, teaspoon settles. Heart rate tucks itself into a slower cardigan. Outside, rain rehearses soft applause on windows. Inside, every tiny sip repeats the board's compromised 2.25 millimeters of assurance, cupping evening thoughts until they too cool to a temperature described as socially confident. Shadows lengthen, paragraphs of day fold down their dog ears, and the measured rim remains. A small promise that some committees, at least, were kind enough to design for sleep. So let your mind set down its own teaspoon, lean back from the saucer's circle, and drift slow. Steady porcelain quiet into rest. You might not expect the gap between the parallel wooden slats of a public park bench to have occupied more committee hours than the placement of statues or fountains. Yet, beginning in 1913, Britain's Office of Civic Comfort managed to devote 3 full summers to the question of exactly how far apart those sleepy planks should sit beneath polite posteriors. If you're still awake when we reach the first tape measure quarrel, feel free to follow along, though please don't fuss. The pigeons certainly never subscribed to anything except crumbs. The matter started with a sheaf of letters from respectable ladies' societies complaining that narrow skirt hems were forever catching on nail heads hidden in the abyss between slats, creating undignified pops like champagne corks heard only by embarrassment. On wet mornings, newspapers added, excess spacing allowed drizzle to percolate upward like gossip from below, painting the unsuspecting seat of every clerk's trousers in abstract battalions of damp. Worst of all, a retired colonel claimed he'd lost a favorite pencil through an unnecessarily cavalier crevice and demanded redress in marching band capitals. Investigators, fueled by tepid cocoa served from an urn that hissed like a tired telegraph, began the first of many field surveys. Using brass gauges borrowed from rail carriage manufacturers, they kneeled beside London benches from Hyde Park to Hampstead Heath, recording each gap to the half millimeter while passers-by mistook them for botanists hunting rare moss. Measurements revealed a lawless sprawl, anything from a hair under 19 millimeters tight, enough to pinch polite fingers attempting rescue missions for pocket change, to a yawning 35, a chasm through which entire programs of summer band concerts had slipped beyond retrieval. The mean, a shrugging 26, apparently represented no one in particular, but averages are comforting in the way oatmeal is comforting, bland, reliable, seldom with Suffolk poetry. Committees adore arithmetic, so arithmetic arrived wielding slide rules like lullabies. Timber suppliers argued for a generous gap to encourage air circulation, promising that dry boards lasted longer than humor. City tailors, invited as expert witnesses, retorted that a modestly narrow distance kept cloth free of souvenir splinters shaped like unwelcome commas. A doctor of rheumatism delivered a paper 12 pages, single-space, claiming that wider slats allowed cold drafts to climb the lumbar region with predatory stealth, a phrase that made stenographers glance warily at their own chairs. To test the theory, 3 volunteers were seated on experimental benches in a refrigerated warehouse normally reserved for butter. After an hour, all reported equal levels of chill regardless of spacing, concluding that the doctor's predatory drafts were largely psychological. The committee thanked them with sandwiches rigid as their conclusions. Somewhere between sandwich and sunset, the board introduced the 10-second coin roll, a brass threepenny bit dropped edgewise into. Any bench should remain upright for the span of a gentle count to 10 before rolling away. Under that metric, a gap of 23 millimeters proved Goldilocks, just right tight enough to cradle the coin, loose enough to release rainwater, and, quite incidentally, perfect for losing mechanical pencil leads, but not pencils. Field. Trials ensued. Inspectors in bowler hats crossed the country armed with stopwatches in pockets, jingling like modest casinos. Each coin's performance was timed, noted, and initialed in triplicate. Records show one inspector became so entranced by the clink-pause roll rhythm that he composed a short waltz, later performed at the ministry's Christmas party, though critics agreed the melody wandered rather like the benches themselves stopped by. Midsummer 1915, timber yards switched to cutting seat boards precisely 3 inches wide. planing edges so square they could have been used to rule copybooks. Carpenters fixed these atop wrought iron frames, inserting cedar spacer blocks machined to the sanctified 23mm width. One micro hook of irony surfaced when a shipment of blocks swelled in coastal humidity, reducing gaps to barely 19mm. Tailors, after years of protest, complained that such stinginess now trapped pocket watch chains. Kill-drain protocols were introduced, and the blocks, suitably disciplined, returned to regulation calm. Meanwhile, newspapers unearthed human interest tailies. A courting couple, seated on an early prototype, discovered the gap's newfound narrowness, allowed their gloved fingers to graze discreetly beneath them without dangling perilously into void. Etiquette columnists approved, noting that romance should always be supported, even by geometry. Conversely, a troop of summer sparrows lamented the loss of their favorite beneath-bench seed cache. Ornithologists reported modest weight loss. Across the colony, though the birds rebounded when picnic season renewed, such reports fluttered like mild breezes through committee minutes, providing just enough whimsy to keep meetings from fossilizing entirely. The Great War slowed production, yet the specification remained quietly patriotic. Soldiers on home leave praised the benches for not soaking greatcoat tails, and advertisements for victory bonds were stapled to slapbacks without fear of disappearing into caverns. When peace returned, Art Deco designers flirted with zigzag seat patterns, but the board, fearing coins would ricochet unpredictably, insisted on the classic parallel array. A light CTA in the form of a poster, "Mind the Gap, Sit with Confidence," appeared. Near bandstands, its slogan soon borrowed by underground officials for somewhat noisier crevices. Decades wandered. Paint layers accumulated. Government issue Brunswick green in the 30s, wartime camouflage brown, post-war optimism cream, and finally a utilitarian municipally cheerful blue. Through each repaint, workmen diligently scraped between slats, with spatulas sized to 23mm, their motions rhythmic enough to lull pigeons into applause disguised as cooing. Scientific curiosity, never fully at rest, resurfaced in the 1960s when an ergonomics professor measured fidget frequency relative to slat spacing. Students subjected to gaps of 30mm found themselves rearranging limbs every 40 seconds, whereas those perched on the standard gap averaged a contented 97. The professor concluded that the bench design promoted thoughtful but unhurried contemplation, a quality urban planners considered as rare as rainless. Bank holidays, even vandalism paid its respects. When teenage whittlers carved initials, they did so on slat tops, leaving spacer blocks untouched, as if some silent instinct told them certain lines should not be crossed. Restoration teams in the 1980s discovered spacer blocks still crisp, their cedar grain aromatic as forgotten drawers, while the iron frames had rusted into sculptural humility. New hardwoods were bolted on, but always at the ordained gulf, measured now by plastic calipers that beeped approvingly at 20-3 tonight. If you wander into a lamplit park and settle on an old bench, chances are you'll feel that century-old arithmetic under you. Slide a coin between slats, any modern penny will do, and count slowly to 10. It will balance just long enough to prove the committee's ghostly hands still study the space. Beneath, damp leaves form quiet mosaics, each too wide to wedge upward, each content to decay at its own pace. Above, your shoulders may relax into the wrought iron scroll, elbows resting where countless elbows have rehearsed unimportant observations, whispering about pigeons, wondering about moon phases, debating whether to rise for cocoa or linger another minute. And as you breathe in that measured emptiness between boards, sensation steadies. Thoughts follow the gentle geometry, gap wood like a metronome set to lullaby. Allow it to pace your breathing. Let trivial drafts pass harmlessly through, just as early committees intended, while the worries snagging at trouser hems stay forever on the other side of the slats. After a while, you might discover the coin has tipped into the leaves with the softest chinka reminder that time. Like small metal discs, and even smaller concerns can slip away without ceremony. When that happens, feel free to tip to inclining, softly from consciousness through a gap exactly wide enough to accommodate a sigh and settle into sleep. You might not expect a plain rectangle of buff cardstock to have sparked enough polite controversy to keep librarians awake past their bedtimes. Yet, beginning in 1905, the American Library Association found itself circling one particular shape, the modest 3x5-inch catalog card like a sleepy planet orbiting its own paper sun. If you're still conscious by the time we meander through the first hesitant shuffle of index drawers, feel free to file yourself under subscribers, provisional, or just let the drawer remain ajar. Registrars once dozed off too, and the shelves never minded. It all started when a shipment of French cards, trimmed to an aristocratic 75mm by 125, jammed the drawers at the Buffalo Public Library with a sullen crunch, inspiring frantic whittling of wooden runners and language unbecoming to nonfiction. Meanwhile, west of the Mississippi, Denver's librarians favored a hardier card, 3 1/4 by 5 1/4, arguing the extra quarter, accommodated the altitude's larger handwriting, an assertion the Plains libraries found lofty in every sense. Letters of complaint fluttered in like so many overdue notices carried by agitated pigeons, drawers stuck, tabs misaligned, paste-on labels hid call numbers the way shy students hide behind encyclopedias. Something had to be measured into submission dots, so at the 1906 Narragansett Conference, a subcommittee on card dimensions convened in a seaside hotel smelling of ink, seaweed, and the faint hope of afternoon scones. Sample cards were fanned across trestle tables, 20 sizes in all, each bearing identical dummy text about the mineral content of oatmeal because even indecision needs fuel. Delegates armed with calipers, tea, and the inexhaustible patience of those who alphabetized for recreation tested how smoothly each specimen slid, stopped, and re-emerged from drawers of assorted vintages. A Harvard cataloger timed extraction speed with a railroad watch. The daintier French size exited drawers faster, but fluttered when reinserted, while the bulky Denver model lumbered like a sleepy bison, yet stayed obediently upright in crosswinds, simulated by an electric fan borrowed from the hotel manager's office. Observers took notes until their nibs squeaked. One concluded that an ideal card should travel with the dignity of a parson, yet retreat with the humility of a sexton. A sentence so soporific it was immediately adopted as the committee's. Informal motto dot by mid-morning, someone produced a middle child, exactly 3 inches high, exactly 5 wide, corners just soft enough to discourage paper cuts, yet sharp enough to look employed. A quick fan test showed it stood braced without swagger, while a drawer slam demonstrated its edges hardly quivered. Melville Dewey, summoned like a punctuation mark to approve consistency, declared the size truly decimal in spirit, if not in number, and hinted it might finally rescue the classified world from what he called hyphen anarchy. An early, sleepy call to action followed. If any library wished to volunteer anecdotal evidence, once their tea cooled sufficiently, the committee would accept postcards postmarked before snowfall. Submissions trickled in. A Vermont librarian reported that the 3x5 fitted snugly into cigar boxes during carpentry delays. A Georgia clerk claimed it stacked to precisely the height of her tabby cat's chin, a measurement no one could refute without summoning the cat. Through winter, the committee nurtured micro-hooks of discovery. Ink blotted differently on various pulps. Too glossy a finish made erasures skid like nervous ice skaters, while too rough, a grain devoured nibs in carnivorous silence. They settled on a mild vellum stock, tinted the lightest cream because white pages, they insisted, glared at lamplight readers like impolite ghosts. Typists in Albany tested line guides. 6 ruled lines encourage concise summaries. 7 encourage gossip. 8 risked illegibility before lunch. After statistically significant yawns, 6 it became. Printers, delighted by constraints, calibrated. Guillotines to slice bundles with a noise the night watchman likened to distant sleet steady, unhurried, faintly lulling. Spring 1908 brought the final vote in a hall whose ceiling fans turned with chapel solemnity. When the chairman intoned 3 inches by 5, the motion passed with more exhalations than applause librarians favor a victory one can nap through. Telegraphed procurement notices blipped across wires, card dimension 3x5 inch stop. Stock vellum light cream stop corners rounded 1/8 inch radius stop. Mills from Maine to Missouri retool blades. Cartons emerged smelling of linen closets and good intentions. Drawer manufacturers celebrated by advertising, standard size approved, though one wag pointed out the label was bigger than the thing it praised. Readers noticed first through. Fingertips, cards no longer snagged on drawer lips like biscuits caught in a tin. They slid with a hushed confidence, the sound of gentle shuffling that could coax even overdue thoughts into order. Children tasked with filing learned the new rhythm pinch, lift, slide accompanied by the soft chuck of tab-meaning follower, a percussion that doubled as lullaby for whichever parent waited in reference chairs. A light breeze across open. Windows still riffled edges, but the cards, packed in modest solidarity, refused to topple. Even errant jacket sleeves, sweeping past on brisk Saturdays, dislodged nothing weightier than desk notes. Pencil notations of accession dates found ample margin, yet not so ample as to encourage rambling. Verbosity crouched, contained within sweetly rectangular borders. Inevitably, novelty tapped at the catalog drawer. One Michigan inventor promoted perforated side margins for detachable subject tags. Trials ended when clerks discovered patrons removing tags as souvenirs. A French stationer floated lavender-tinted stock to soothe ocular nerves, but librarians complained the hue made every author seem recently deceased, yet the base dimension endured. During wartime paper rationing, thickness thinned but withheld. Microfilm technologies flirted with abolishing cards altogether, yet the drawers stayed, humming microclimates of order. Only computer databases would threaten their reign, and even then, secretaries kept back a sturdy handful in bottom drawers for jotting passwords they might forget. Tonight, should you wander into any archive still arranged by human breath, rather than blinking cursor, pull a long wooden drawer until the brass stops size. There, like rows of pastel dominoes, 3x5s stand waiting, edges winking where countless thumbs nudge them forward. Choose one at random perhaps, Hydrology Minor Brooks, 1872, and feel the light cream surface warm under the lamp. The top third bears a scent of graphite, the lower half a whisper of eraser crumb, each residue an echo of someone else's quiet conquest over reference. Slide it back, hear the soft accord as it nestles home, and understand why a subcommittee once watched coins roll, ink dry, and pencils snap in pursuit of so unassuming a horizon line. Breathe with that drawer a moment longer. Hear the minuscule friction of card against card, a sound like moth wings dusting upholstery. Let your thoughts align to those evenly trimmed edges, steady, measured, unhurried. The night outside thickens into a whisper, lamps pool amber, and the catalog. Content in its centuries of compromise keeps watch. If your eyelids begin to archive today's impressions, allow them. The dimensions are already settled, the slips cut true, the drawers half open like gentle invitations. Follow their example. File the last stray worry under sleep, general. Close the drawer with muted satisfaction, and drift, card by careful card, into rest. You might not expect the number of seconds an elevator door hesitates before it decides to meet its other half to have occupied years of quiet paperwork. Yet in 1957, the National Vertical Transport Council began timing that very pause initially with a battered stopwatch, later with machines that clicked like polite typewriters, so insistently that entire buildings learned to breathe in sync with their conclusions. If you are somehow still awake by the time we drift past the first mechanical sigh, feel free to lean on the subscribe button the way one might lean on a brass call panel gently, without hurry and with absolutely no expectation that anything will happen quickly. The crusade began after a civil servant in Milwaukee lodged a formal complaint that the new municipal tower's elevators snapped shut in a manner suggestive of trapdoors, thereby traumatizing an unfortunate briefcase, and allegedly its owner's sense of dignity. By contrast, a delegation from Boise reported doors so languid that writers routinely grew awkward about eye contact somewhere around the 10th second of mutual waiting. These two data points, the anxious snap and the polite dawdle, landed on the same desk in Washington, where a clerk noticed that, when stacked, they framed a deliciously solvable mystery. How long should a door tarry to sound considerate yet determined? VelvetHist study group was summoned to room 314B, a space furnished with nothing flashier than gray linoleum and chairs that squeaked as though conspiring to break attention spans. 12 elevators from across the country were shipped as complete. Mock-ups, shafts omitted, but personalities intact. One clicked its doors together like an irritated secretary. Another inched toward closure with the dreamy pace of warm honey. Engineers wired each specimen to a stopwatch, then took turns pressing door close while sipping weak coffee that tasted faintly of transit budgets. They discovered that 7 seconds felt brisk but not brusque, 9 seconds benevolent but faintly indecisive, and 8 brought about a hush like that moment in chess when no piece feels provoked. A light, sleepy call for public input went out. If you have thoughts on the timing of vertical thresholds, kindly share at your leisure, and letters trickled in, perfumed by stationery, coffee, or whatever else flavored office drawers. One hotel pianist claimed 8-second doors harmonized best with the sustained pedal on middle. C. A postmaster wrote that 8 allowed exactly one folded newspaper to be tucked under an arm without creasing headlines. Meanwhile, a Kansas farmer visiting the big city observed that cows blink every 8 seconds on average, so the doors must be sensible. The committee nodded, adding a marginal note that livestock behavior, while charming, had limited metropolitan relevance. Test buildings were outfitted with adjustable timers hidden behind mild steel panels stamped approved, though the approval remained tentative, like a librarian whispering a recommendation without quite endorsing the ending. Observers stood inside cabs holding clipboards, notating human choreography. At 7 seconds, conversation ceased prematurely, leaving compliments to dangle unresolved. At 9, half the writers attempted a second remark they immediately regretted. 8 seconds produced merely a shared exhale neither, abrupt nor extended, after which shoes shuffled in springs, murmured as doors whispered together with the gentlest thunk. Microhooks surfaced throughout. A typist noticed that elevator music faded exactly 1 bar farther when doors lingered 9 seconds, thereby revealing an unexpected lyric about moonlight and mayonnaise that nobody had heard before nor since. A janitor reported that 8-second pauses reduced floor wax scuffs by 10%, possibly because restless feet had less time to shuffle. An actuary calculated that across all federal buildings, 8 seconds saved 43 man-hours per fiscal quarter compared to 9, then ruined the drama by admitting nobody could decide what to do with the reclaimed time. Engineers fine-tuned the mechanism. A clay cam soft the last inch of travel. Rubber bumpers thickened to hush that final kiss of steel. and a small capacitor introduced a signed delay between button press and motor hum, ensuring the rider's intention registered long before. Machinery obliged. Someone joked the capacitor's real function was to give second thoughts a safe place to perch. Minutes recorded laughter sufficient but subdued. By 1961, drafts of the recommended door dwell interval circulated for comment. 8 seconds, plus or minus a charitable half, headlined the page like a bedtime mantra. Manufacturers recalibrated relays, and for the first time, elevator doors nationwide began speaking the same sleepy dialect. Riders adopted quickly, briefcases tucked under arms as if trained, hands removed from pockets at beat 7, feet pointed forward by beat 8. Lobby attendants sensed a new rhythm, less stamping impatience, fewer near-miss apologies, more of that small collective nod humans gift one another when machinery behaves. Outliers persisted, of course. A Chicago insurance tower insisted on 5-second darts to project modern efficiency. Tenants retaliated by overriding timers with toothpicks, racking up an impressive pile of splinters and memorandum rebukes. The Empire Hotel in Reno opted for 12 languorous seconds, hoping gamblers might reconsider the lure of daylight before reaching the lobby. Instead, many simply fell asleep against chrome rails, which housekeeping polished nightly with resigned affection. Still, the 8-second doctrine held steady elsewhere, buoyed by reports that its cadence matched the average length of a single deep breath. Winter of 1963 brought final ratification. 8 seconds enshrined, capacitors specified. Tolerances charted like softly rounded hills on drafting vellum. Instructions advised routine checks with a pocket watch of no fewer than 7 joules, a detail that delighted horologists and baffled procurement clerks in equal measure. Door close buttons, once immediate as startled birds, were retarded. To comply, some were even disconnected, their press now placebo, an early lesson in how patience can be engineered through gentle deception. Years drifted. Digital controllers replaced relays, yet engineers programmed them to echo the old pause. Museums of Science displayed a vintage 1958 timer, alongside placards that made children giggle at the phrase, dwell interval. Office gossip evolved. Pressing the button twice was rumored to have the weight, though circuits ignored the plea and merely blinked a smug lamp in reply. Still, the ritual comforted people, a small assertion of will, albeit imaginary, much like straightening papers before a meeting destined to postpone decisions. Tonight, perhaps you stand alone in a hushed Cicero lobby, elevator button glowing amber under a tired thumb. The doors part, interior lighting sighs awake. You enter, spin, press your floor. Now watch the panels brush steel, reflecting one calm face, and count silently the beats. 1, 2, 3. Around 6, you might feel the world pause just long enough for uncertainty to wave a hand. Yet by 8, the halves touch, magnets kiss, and ascent begins. Somewhere in that measured hush lives the legacy of committees who timed breath, chatter, and even cow blink so you could rise without noticing the arithmetic of courtesy. Let that arithmetic lull you now. Picture timer cams rotating at the pace of distant lighthouse beams, copper contacts closing like fingertips meeting mittened palms, motors spooling cables in a hum just softer than thought. Floors slide by, numbered bulbs ping, but urgency stays parked in the lobby, eating yesterday's newspapers. If your eyelids drift as steadily as the cab, allow them. Engineers once calculated that sleep, like doors, benefits from intervals. Neither rushed nor delayed. 8 seconds, 8 breaths, 8 small glides of eyelash against cheek, each enough space for waking to depart and dreaming to board. When the doors of consciousness meet at last, they'll do so with that same gentle thunk, sealing you comfortably into the quiet shaft of night. You might not expect the angle of a screw thread, The humble slanted groove that spirals around bolts and basement toolboxes to have prompted decades of gentle argument. Yet beginning in 1841, British engineers debated that tilt so persistently that the world's hardware drawers now hum a single lullaby of 60 degrees. If you're still awake by the time we twirl past the first quiet turn of the wrench, feel free to subscribe, or simply let the button idle like a patient vice. Standards committees once idled too, and the machines never hurried them dot. It began in workshops that smelled of linseed oil and half-cooled iron, where millwrights tried mating bolts from Leeds with nuts from Liverpool, only to discover the threads sulked past one another like mismatched clock gears. Some grooves leaned at 55 degrees, some at 65, some at angles so ad hoc they looked drawn by size. A locomotive foreman complained his crews were carrying 3 spanners for every one bolt, which made front pockets clink like modest xylophones during tea breaks. Enter Joseph Whitworth, a man who believed even chaos could be coaxed into incremental obedience. With a brass protractor, a pile of orphans' bolts, and the unhurried faith of someone counting sheep, he measured thread after thread until the arithmetic of their disagreement settled into a single proposition: lean them all exactly 60 degrees, pitch them by whole number threads per inch, and let the metal doze contentedly, the hook as soft as a lathe burr came from Whitworth's first public demonstration. He fitted one of his new bolts through a plate drilled lazily crypt, tapped it once with a wooden mallet, and it seated itself so naturally the watching apprentices applauded in whispers. Newspapers ran sleepy sketches of the groove, calling it engineering's new bedtime story, a pun that grated on editors but survived because deadlines, like drill bits, grow blunt. Within weeks, manufacturers received a light CTA printed in polite copperplate. Should you remain awake beyond supper, kindly try the 60-degree form. Refusal will not be prosecuted, merely frowned upon. Most firms allergic to frowns complied, though a few continental workshops muttered that French threads already sang sweetly at 55. Thank you, and would not relearn the tune. Each workshop that adopted the Whitworth pitch became a microhook generator. In Birmingham, a machinist observed the new angle expelled swarf in spirals so tidy they resembled metal fettuccine. A shipyard rigger swore the improved grip allowed him to tighten handrails by exactly 3 turns instead of the previous awkward 2.5. Somewhere in Glasgow, a blacksmith balanced 8 Whitworth nuts atop one another and claimed the stack stood straighter than a parish choir. An image so gently absurd spread through pubs faster than mild ale. Yet none of these anecdotes wandered far. They circled back into the main thread, tightening the narrative of calm inevitability by 1860 railway companies ordered tens of thousands of bolts ground to the new law. Warehouses filled with boxes stenciled W1/2 to 12, W3/4 to 10, codes that looked like fractions daydreaming. Clerks, soothed by the symmetry, reported fewer ledger errors. One found she no longer wrote question marks in the screw column, a habit that had previously bewildered accountants. Even the Royal Navy, famously fastidious about salt and steel, commissioned vast stores of Whitworth threads, remarking that guns assembled 20 minutes faster when each bolt trusted every nut on the shelf. Somewhere between those guns and grandmother's sewing machines, the 60-degree angle quietly nested into domestic life. Lamp bases, piano stools, folding prams all began to revolve in metrical calm. There were tangents, of course, the micro hooks that pop up every half minute to keep attention's eyelids propped. One inventor proposed a left-hand Whitworth thread for products destined for Australia, arguing water drains anti-clockwise below the equator and screws should sympathize. Patent reviewers, half amused, declined. Another tradesman carved a double start. Whitworth, hoping 2 smaller grooves would fasten twice as quickly, Customers found the effect disorienting, like climbing stairs two at a time while the staircase shrank. The design retired, head bowed, to toolshed folklore. A soft punchline circulated. What has 60 degrees and keeps secrets? Answer. A Whitworth bolt tight enough to impersonate peace and quiet. Through repetition, the reward cycle persisted. Detail Anglake's band workshop tail soft humor returned. Each time the pattern settled, committees refined thread tables, adding sizes and fractions that felt like lullaby verses, 1/4 by 20, 5/16 by 18, 3/8 by 16. The numbers, when read aloud, slowed breaths. Factory inspectors noticed machines vibrated less when all fasteners followed identical geometry. Operators speculated the bolts themselves, whispered correspondence crest to crest, root to root asking about life at the far end of torque. Across the Atlantic, however, American engineers preferred threads of 60 degrees but different pitch. Counts, the inevitable transoceanic compromise, arrived in 1898 as sellers convened under gaslit chandeliers to trade wrenches in size. The unified thread, they decided, would share the Whitworth angle but adopt flattened crest to please American lays allergic to sharp peaks. Some Brits grumbled the flattening ruined poetry. Yankees shrugged, claiming practicality hums its own lullaby. Yet both camps agreed the 60-degree slope must remain, the universal pillow on which every nut could finally rest. World wars rolled through foundries, but even urgency bowed to angle. Shell casings, tank tracks, aircraft engine blocks all carried the subdued genealogy of Whitworth's early sketches. Soldiers tightening bolts by lantern light seldom knew they were twisting history's quiet compromise, but their hands remembered. In post-war suburbia, lawnmower handles assembled on kitchen floors clicked into place with the same measured feel. Half turn, nudge, quarter turn. Release like a metronome, marking moderation. Meanwhile, the ISO committee, always attracted to slumber-worthy vistas, adopted metric derivatives, M61 threads sharing identical degrees, though measured in millimeters that rolled off engineers' tongues like small, soothing pebbles. Micro-hucks persisted. A Swiss watchmaker demonstrated screws so tiny a puff of breath might misthread them, yet thanks to the angle they aligned under a jeweler's loop, as obediently as grandfather clock bolts the size of crayons. Hobbyists building model railways discovered that mild steel bots and brass nuts, seldom seized when the 60-degree womb carried a dab of machine oil, call it engineering's chamomile. Even stories of failure lulled more than startled. One coastal power plant ordered replacement bolts mispitched by a single thread per inch. Defects so subtle it jammed at the third turn, producing a mutter rather than catastrophe. Fitters, recognizing the unique rasp, paused, fetched gauges, and returned the batch. Disaster, bored, wandered off to sea. Minutes filed the incident under illustrative of standards necessity, a heading sure to induce nods dot, and now, long after Whitworth's protractor has yellowed to the shade of old toast, you may grip any ordinary screw, hold it to the lamp, and see those rhythmic grooves circling down like a gentle staircase into focus. Tilt it. Watch light stripe the flanks at one precise angle steeper than lethargy, gentler than haste inviting a screwdriver to settle, bite, and turn. Feel the thread recall every lathe hymn hummed in century-old warehouses, each verse smoothing. Burrs into lullabies. Turn slowly between thumb and finger. One revolution, perhaps two. Hear the faint rasp, a dry whisper reminiscent of pages turning in reference volumes nobody now checks out. Breathe with that rasp. Imagine endless rows of bolts cooling on conveyor belts, their grooves catching evening lamplight like concentric sunsets. Picture them shipped across oceans in crates padded with straw and quiet expectation, waiting to bring two given pieces of the world calmly together. Consider that each crest, each root, carries within it 60-degree discipline the promise that things can connect without drama wood to steel, motion to rest. Waking to sleep, if your eyelids begin sliding down their own measured slope, let them follow the spiral inward. Feel thoughts thread gently into dusk, memory meshing with dream, concern tightening just enough to hold, but never so much it strips. The pitch is chosen, the angle keeps, the torque of days spent. One final half turn, snug but not strained, and the mind, like a well-seated nut, can stop spinning. In that stillness, a hush rings faintly metal against metal, root to crest signaling. Assembly complete, story secured, night fastened. Allow that hush to settle over you, a standard quietly achieved, and drift into sleep.